Welcome to the KidMin podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything KidMin
and pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Virginia and I are going to be talking today about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And it's one that we actually started talking about the other day because we saw a question on Facebook. But it's a question that I have gotten a lot over the years. And that is, does our church want to start a weekday ministry? And I love talking about this topic for a few reasons. One, I had served at two different churches over the years that had a weekday ministry. One of those I was serving on staff. The second one, I was in charge of all of the weekday ministries that the church provided, which was basically we had kids birth through 12th grade in the building, all day long. 5 days a week, most weekends, but the whole 9 yards. So we had a Christian school and a weekday ministry. And so I have been in charge of those programs for many years. But also I had the opportunity at another position that I had where I worked with churches who were thinking of or had decided to start one type of weekday ministry or another, whether it was before and after care school program, whether it was a full-on Christian school, whether it was just preschool, if it was just a Parents' Day Out program. That was part of my responsibility, was that I would travel to these churches, help do walkthroughs, answer questions, meet with committees and staff to discuss the pros and cons. So it's something that I enjoy talking about.
Yeah, and I've had the experience of being at one of my early experiences in ministry. I was at a church that had a weekday preschool that had their own dedicated space. I've been at a church with a weekday preschool where we shared the space, also with Wednesday and Sunday ministries. I've been at a church where we hosted a homeschool group one day a week during the school year. And so lots of different ways that can look, but a lot of the same considerations, yes. No matter how you're doing it.
No matter how you're doing it. And that was one of the things that we thought we would talk about today. We wanted to talk about how do you make that decision? Why should you or would you start a weekday ministry? We want to cover the pros and the cons. We want to be very, very upfront. And that is one of the things, and Virginia and I were talking about this earlier, I do have a special place in my heart for weekday ministries, but I also have tried to be very, very honest with leadership as they're considering it, because there are a lot of things that you need to make sure you have ready and things that you are prepared for if you are thinking about going into this ministry. And so I try to be really honest about it. So we're going to do the pros and the cons. We're going to talk about both. And then we're also going to give you some steps for where to begin if you are in the process of thinking about starting a weekday ministry in your church. So hopefully we'll hit any burning questions that you may have. First, let's define a weekday ministry in case people are like, you keep saying that term, but you're not exactly explaining what that is. A weekday ministry can cover a lot of different things. Basically, it's any kind of program that your church is wanting to provide to the community during the week, Monday through Friday in your building. And so that might be a Parents' Day Out program where maybe just one morning a week or a couple of mornings a week you have the opportunity for parents to drop their kids off, and they can kind of take the morning to do whatever they need to do, and they come back and pick them up around noon or so. You could do a part-time preschool, which would be preschool age children, and we're going to talk about this in just a few minutes, but it usually starts at 6 weeks. But some start later than that. But basically infants through pre-K or through 3-year-olds, if you are not wanting to do a pre-K or a kindergarten. There are a lot of churches that do infants through kindergarten, and that's all that they provide. Or you might have a before and after school care program where parents can drop off the kids before school. They were picked up by the school buses to go to school, and then they're dropped back off at the church in the afternoons until parents pick them up. Or you could provide a full Christian school and have birth through 12th grade or through 6th grade or through 8th grade, or however you would want to put that together, and have an actual Christian school in the building. So these weekday programs can look very different according to what your church ministry is wanting to provide. I usually start off with the question, why do you want to start a weekday ministry? I talk with a lot of pastors, with a lot of leaders that have some very strong, passionate reasons why they feel like their church should have a weekday program. And so the answers usually range from, we're wanting to do outreach to our community, we're wanting to grow our church with young families and young children, and we're hoping that the weekday ministry will give us that option. We have, people who just genuinely see a need in their community and they're wanting to minister to their community. Maybe they might be even wanting to minister to their own parents if they know that maybe some parents that are already members of the church are struggling with childcare, and so they're wanting to provide assistance there. And then actually, I have a lot of pastors, a lot of church staff that will say to me, we think it would be a great way to add a little extra money to our budget. And so we're really looking at this as a business. And so we're hoping to make money through this. Have you basically heard some of those, Virginia?
Yes, that I have heard all of those. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those are very, very kind and noble reasons for wanting to start a weekday ministry. A lot of people really do have a genuine heart for wanting to reach out to the community, wanting to minister to kids, wanting to minister to parents. And I think that that's wonderful. I do usually discourage those who are telling me that they are hoping that it would be a way for their ministry to raise some funds or to add to their budget, because it takes a very long time, if ever, to make money through a weekday ministry. And we're going to talk about why that is as we go through pros and cons. But if that is your primary reason for what you're wanting to do, you have to realize that typically a weekday ministry is just that. It is a ministry that your church is providing. It's really going to take a bigger hit on your budget than it is to bring in any money to your budget. You are very blessed if you're even able to break even, at least for the first few years, but usually even in the long term with the weekday ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of hidden costs, which I'm sure we'll get into more, but lots of hidden costs that may not become apparent, especially with maintenance and upkeep and facilities and utilities, that may not become apparent until you're already deep in it and you say, oh no.
Yes. I think that what we want to do with our conversation first is to start with the pros, the real reasons why people genuinely want to start a weekday ministry and the great things that can come from having a weekday ministry. And I said earlier, I am going to be very honest about the pros and the cons. And so we probably may spend a little bit more time on the cons than we are going to on the pros, just because I want to make sure that everybody is very prepared for this ministry before you even consider stepping into it. But I do want to talk about some of the great blessings that can come from a weekday ministry, because I have experienced a lot of those, and I've worked with a lot of churches that have experienced these pros, and they do really love their weekday ministry. We're going to start out with the most obvious. It is a great outreach to community. One of the reasons why it's so very needed is because there are limited options for childcare in most cities in the United States, and probably especially the larger cities. it is really hard to find a great daycare that people can afford, that they do trust. And so to be able to offer that to families, especially families within your church family, to be able to give them a safe and loving place to bring their kids where they're going to get a biblical foundation along with the other things that are going to be taught in a weekday program in a preschool. It's just a wonderful opportunity to be able to provide that for families. I think, again, it offers the opportunity not just to reach out to your community itself, but also to be able to reach out to the families within your church family that are already members. With the community, again, some churches are in areas where having a childcare opportunity is really useful. If you are in a suburban area where there are a lot of families where both parents work, if you are in a downtown area that has a lot of office buildings, that has a lot of businesses where parents are coming into work, having that location is very helpful for them. It's definitely something that you want to check out in your community to make sure that there's even a need for it. Because if your church is so far away from those suburban or business areas, you might not be a great location to be able to provide for the community because your community may not have that need. But that is something that can be a real positive. The other thing is just the opportunity that we have to provide a Christian alternative to families and communities, to be able to give them that chance for them to have a biblical foundation for their kids, for them to be able to come to school every day and to learn about Scripture and to learn about how it can be implemented into our daily lives and how it can even be implemented into every subject that you learn when you're in school. Christian education gives kids the opportunity for that in just such a wonderful way. And it's one of the things that I love the most about working in a weekday ministry, because like I said, I had the pleasure of being able to serve with birth through 12th grade. So I was able to work with kids all the way through their educational process and give them that biblical foundation. And so that's definitely a blessing. There are also a lot of churches that feel that they have been blessed with a very large building that can often sit unused during the week. Of course, it's according to your ministry and exactly what happens there during the week. But there are a lot of churches that have a very large building and the majority of it isn't used during the week. It's only used on Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights. And so they feel like that this is an opportunity for them to be able to have more functions in their building throughout the week and get the most use out of their space. I don't feel like that is a strong enough reason for that to be the only reason why you would have a weekday ministry. And we're going to talk about those things when we hit the cons. But it is something that is often mentioned when I talk to leaders about why they're wanting to have a weekday ministry. It's because they're wanting to see every inch of their building used every single day.
And I think in my mind, one of the safest ways to sort of approach this decision of, why do we want to have a weekday ministry? What are our reasons for this? I think one of the safest ways to think about it is to make sure that you really have a desire to serve your community. If there is a strong desire to meet a need and to serve your community through this as a ministry, and again, yes, you're going to charge tuition, you're going to charge fees, but viewing it as a way to minister to your community, then in my mind, that is the safest way to approach these considerations. Right. Because if you go in with an expectation that, okay, we're either going to get funds back from this that we can reinvest into the church, or with an expectation that, this is going to grow our church, those expectations may not be met through this ministry. And so I think going into it with the thought that, listen, there's this dire need across the U.S. and in our community for safe, affordable childcare or Christian schooling in our community. And so we are going to meet this need for our community because we love our community, because we want to invest in our community, because we feel like this is what God is calling our church to do specifically in our community. And so I think that is the safest way to approach the considerations about starting some sort of weekday ministry, because you just can't, whatever dividends you're hoping to get, whether they are literal or relational or whatever, you can't necessarily count on those, because you don't know what's going to happen. Because I mean, obviously you can be as financially responsible as humanly possible, and there's still unexpected expenses. You can invest in parents with a tremendous amount of effort and intentionality and time, and it's just not reciprocated. And so I think going into it with the approach that, like, we are just going to minister to our community and do the best we can and be faithful, and we're doing this because God has called our church to do this. Right. And just be okay with maybe the outcomes taking a long time to build into what you would hope for, what you would expect.
Well, and that's the thing. You are bringing a lot of people into your building every single day. And I used to tell a lot of our staff that, not everyone has that opportunity to have, hundreds of families walking in through your door every single day for you to be able to minister to be able to reach out to. But you also have to realize that a lot of those families, if they're looking for Christian education for their children, if that's their primary reason for coming to your weekday ministry, then they more than likely already have a church family that they are a part of. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these hundreds of families that are coming to your building every day are actually going to start attending your church. But it is the opportunity for a lot of families to be able to be in a church building when they might not be in one any other time during the week, because there are a lot of families that are looking for safe, affordable childcare. That Christian education portion of it is not necessarily their primary reason for being there. So they might not have a church family or community, and you will be providing that for them. But again, you can't be looking for what you're going to get out of a ministry like this. You really have to go into it looking for what you can provide for others and be okay with that. Because even if you're going to try to convince your church family to invest in this ministry, you don't want to make promises that you are not necessarily going to be able to follow through on. So you don't want to tell them, yes, we hope we're going to have a lot of new church members because of this ministry. Yes, we hope we're going to be able to make a little bit of extra money to go towards our budget because of this ministry, because those things are not given. They're not absolute, like you said. And so you definitely don't want those things to be your primary reason for going into this ministry. Now, you may say, well, I've talked with this church or with that church that has a weekday ministry, and they make a lot of money, But again, it may be according to how long they've been doing it, what kind of backing they have from the church for the ministry budget to begin with. There's a lot of variables to it. So you definitely can't just go into it thinking, oh, this is a definite for this particular reason. Also, their needs are going to be different than yours. And so you want to definitely make sure that you have thought through all of the needs before you jump in. I really don't want anyone to think when they start to hear, because now I'm ready to go into my cons list, and I don't want that to be like, wow, she's super negative. I don't want you to think that of my heart. I want you to see that my intention is that I want to be very transparent going into this. And when I say cons, I don't necessarily mean negative as much as I'm just saying these are the things that you need to take into consideration before you jump in, because these are the realities of weekday ministry.
Yeah, they are considerations.
Yes, they are. They are. And they can all be things that can have a negative impact if you are not very careful about how to approach it. So these are just those things that I want you to be aware of and be prepared for. And the very first one that I have for that is just basically the things that you need to have to make this ministry successful, and that's going to be staff. You're going to need to have experienced teachers to be able to work with preschoolers. You're going to have licensed teachers if you're going to be an accredited elementary school or high school. So you do have staff needs that are very important. This is not, a lot of people will say, well, we have a lot of ladies in our church that love to work with kids, but it does take a specific set of skills to be able to teach preschool and to be able to care for kids in a daycare setting. So you have to remember, you do have staffing needs. You're going to have insurance requirements. You're going to have a payroll. You're going to have teachers that are going to expect to be paid on a regular basis that they can count on with a competitive salary. So, you do have payroll to consider. There are not going to be people that are going to want to do this job just out of the kindness of their hearts. This is definitely something that requires a regular salary for. You are going to have to be prepared to do background checks and all of the things that come along with that, which is usually another cost because it's typically not something that you can get. Sometimes churches may tell me, well, we're able to do our background checks free of charge for our church. But again, even if you do have a ministry or a service that provides that for churches, if you are going to be charging for a daycare situation, those companies are not going to be so willing to do that just because you are a church. They're going to want to do that through their typical paid ways of providing those background checks. There is going to be maintenance to your building, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute, but you do have to think about the maintenance needs. And then you also need to think about the fact that you're going to have additional staffing that would be available when your teachers are out sick or have a family emergency. So you're going to have a substitutes list of staff as well. So that's going to be something else that you're going to have to be sure you have prepared.
And some of these considerations with a lot of this in my mind kind of falls under like HR stuff, like with hiring and with payroll and all this kind of stuff. Thinking through what are your expectations for your teachers in I guess many states. I don't know. I can't say universally because I don't know, but there are certain certifications even for preschool teachers to where, again, if you're going to be in a licensed accredited preschool or childcare program, the teachers have to do certain certifications. They have to do continuing education. And so thinking about that as far as your teachers, thinking about your considerations with, are you going to ask that all of your teachers are members of your church? Are you going to ask them to be members of a church? Are you going to ask them, have an expectation that they serve in their church regularly? Are you going to have certain lifestyle or theological expectations of your teachers in making those decisions beforehand and laying all that out beforehand? When it comes to like handling payroll, handling like liability insurance for your school, who's going to handle that? Like, will the person who works at the church and handles the church payroll, will they also handle the school payroll? Do you need to hire a separate person to keep these two entities separate? Which is a whole other thing that typically a school or a preschool is going to be its own nonprofit entity that is separate from the church that will need its own liability insurance, for example. And so there's a lot of legal considerations behind all of that is not my area of expertise at all.
Well, and that's not something that just comes very naturally for people. A lot of churches will say, well, my children's minister can handle this. They handle it for Sunday mornings, but you have to realize that it is a completely different kind of ministry. It's a completely different kind of business. There are completely different kinds of requirements for having that ministry in your church building every day. And we're going to hit a whole lot of those here as we go on through a lot of the considerations that you're going to need to take, very serious look at. But this is not something that can just be tacked on to your children's minister responsibilities. That's just not something that's going to work well. It's going to need to have its own individual leadership, and it needs to be somebody that is familiar with daycares, with schools, with education. And so those are things that you really have to think through when you're looking at this type of ministry.
Well, and that's so true, because I mean, administrating a school, even if it is a weekday preschool, is still very different than leading a Sunday, Wednesday ministry. Right. And I mean, that is, in, I would think, a lot of cases, its own full-time or possibly part-time, I don't know, it's its own role. Right. That is very different than being a minister.
And it really depends on what you're looking to do. Are you looking to do it, like we mentioned earlier, the different types? Are you looking to do a part-time preschool program? Are you looking at part-time daycare at a parent's day out? Or are you looking at a fully accredited school? What you're looking at doing. And a lot of churches will start with the weekday and maybe kindergarten, and then maybe add a grade per year if they are wanting to look at doing a Christian elementary school or a Christian high school. But again, you do have to start with all of those basics for your daycare, for your preschool, for that portion of it. And I've had a lot of people say to me, well, I don't plan on being an accredited school. We're not going to be doing that. We are just offering daycare. But most every single state has very specific requirements for their daycare programs. And just because you are in a church building, that doesn't mean you don't have to follow them. You do have to follow them. The state is going to require you to. And so again, that's something that you have to look at. And I've always had a lot of people say, well, can you just tell me what all those requirements would be? The problem is that every state has their own requirements. Sometimes every county has their own specific requirements. So even if you're in the same state as another weekday program, that doesn't mean that the requirements that your city is going to require of you are the same. They vary according to your location. And it's you find that very quickly as you talk with other weekday ministry leaders, because you find out, oh, well, they don't have to worry about this, or, oh, they don't have to do this. So even if you say, I'm not going to be fully accredited, we're just going to have this program, you still have to follow certain licensure requirements for your community. And sometimes that's according to how large you are. But again, it varies according to the county and to the state. So that's something that you're going to have to become very familiar with as you look at that. And then just moving straight into the next one, you're going to be sharing space. And that can come with a lot of interesting challenges, because not very many churches can begin these programs and have two separate facilities. There are some churches that will, raise the funds and build a building that is just for their weekday ministry, and it is held completely separately from their church building where they have Sunday school, Bible study, Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, those kind of things. That is very rare. You do not see that very often. Typically, when you see a weekday ministry within a church building, they are sharing the same classrooms, the same space, the same gym, the same, cafeteria area, all the same spaces are going to be shared. And so that takes on a whole set of challenges according, again, to your state requirements, but also just in the wear and tear of your building.
Yeah, and I think there's so much with all of that, because one, there are certain requirements of your facilities as far as, emergency egresses, whether it's through a door or a window, and, sprinkler systems, and just all kinds of facilities requirements from the state in order to operate a school or a preschool in the space. And then also all the considerations of sharing space and the competing interests of having teachers who walk into a space and say, this is my classroom. Right. And having ministry leaders walk into the same space and say, okay, this is our Awana room, this is our Sunday school room, this is our, whatever it is. And having to navigate the expectations around those shared spaces. It definitely takes a lot of communication, setting expectations very clearly, coming to an agreement on those expectations.
Yes. We have an actual whole episode on sharing space because that is an issue that we hear a lot. We have a lot of questions about that. Some of the interesting things that most people don't realize is, like, for example, for us, for our daycare, for our preschool portion, we were licensed through the state because we were required to be. And what I always found so interesting and also so frustrating is that the state for us in Tennessee at that time, now this has been several years, but at that time, you had to have a certain number of things on each wall. Like you had to have certain, lesson materials, alphabet, that kind of thing. You had to have certain amounts of pictures that the kids had drawn. You had to have a certain amount of display items. You had to have a certain amount of toys for different activities. You had to have certain toys for certain activities. And those were all required by our licensing through the state to have present in every classroom. Well, we shared that space with our Sunday school classes, with our Bible study classes, with our, all of our events. But all of those things had to be up throughout the week. The other thing that I found very interesting with that is that our fire code requirements were that we didn't have certain things on the walls and certain items in the classroom.
Didn't have a ton of paper all over the walls.
Yes. So it was always very frustrating to me that those two things could not come together. I really hope that over the years that they have come to some sort of agreement over that, because it was very difficult to be able to make everyone happy. But it definitely caused a struggle because a lot of our Sunday school teachers, a lot of our Bible study leaders, our choir leaders had a hard time putting their materials up because the weekday program's materials had to be up every single day throughout the week. And so we did have a lot of creative ways that we shared space, and we made it work, and we did make it work, and it was hard, but we could do it. And that would be, if you want to hear that episode, you can go back and listen to our shared space episode, because I think I talk about that a lot in that episode. But that's one of the things that we have to consider. One of the things that I always tried to tell my teachers, whether it was through the preschool or if it was the elementary school or the high school, was that we are primarily a church. We Amen. Are a church first.
Amen.
And we are a school second. And so we had to honor that. And so it's important that you make that distinction of, how is this ministry? How are we going to look at this shared space? Are we a church first with a weekday ministry, or are we going to be very focused on our weekday ministry, and our church is going to support that and encourage that in different ways? So, it's a tough balance. And I'll be quite honest with you, a lot of the churches that I worked with as they made the decision to close their weekday ministry, it was over arguments with shared space because it's such a very difficult thing. So things like whether or not the church is going to charge a monthly fee to the weekday ministry so that they're putting funds back into the church, or is the church going to donate the power and the, all of the electricity and the water and the wear and tear on carpets and walls and space? Are they going to pull that into their own budget, church budget, and that's part of how they're ministering to their weekday program? So you have to make all of those decisions ahead of time, but they are definitely a tightrope that you're walking, and you want to make sure that you have all of those decisions made before your very first day. These are things that you really have to have in place.
Yes. Well, and we, in the churches that I've been in, we always viewed the weekday ministry as a ministry of the church. So just like what you're saying, where this is first a church building, and that it secondarily has a weekday program that takes place in it. And, one example from that is, and this is something that we've talked about in probably a lot of different episodes, about within our church spaces, especially in our preschool spaces, one of the things that we are very passionate about is not having like secular or like fictitious characters in our church spaces. Because whenever kids come to church, we want everything that they encounter at church to be true and real.
Right.
And for a well-meaning, weekday teacher to think, okay, well, I want to do my whole room in Curious George because I like Curious George and it's cute and kids like it and da-da-da, or, whatever. And just kind of having to go and have, a gracious conversation and explain our philosophies as a church on how we handle those kind of fictitious characters.
Right.
And it's funny because in the midst of that conversation, it was sort of like, again, like the teacher, it's very easy to get in the mindset, this is my classroom. And I'm like, well, but on Sunday mornings, this is a Sunday school room. Right. And just sort of that like switch of like, oh, okay. It's not that I personally think that, Curious George is bad or whatever, it's not that I have anything against silly stories. It's just that like, this is a church space first.
Right.
And, we've got to keep it more neutral than that.
Right. And it is very possible. A lot of people will think, oh, well, if we're a church, we can't become state licensed because we want to be able to teach Bible, and we wouldn't be able to teach Bible if we were licensed by the state. And that typically is not true. Typically, all of the states, as far as I'm familiar with, are very much aware of Christian education and state licensing and accreditation, and all of those things are still possible within your parameters of what you're teaching, how you're teaching it. Even if you are a college prep school, to be able to do the things that you need to do to be able to prepare them for college, you should be able to do within a Christian education framework. The difference, and like what Virginia is saying, though, is that a lot of times teachers will come in that maybe do not have that Christian background, and they struggle with not including things that you might prefer not be included in your Christian education framework. So, it's not that those two things can't exist together. Mm-hmm. They can, but sometimes you just have to help educators understand and staff to understand this is what our heart is, this is our mission, this is our focus, and so we're not going to have these things. We're going to find other ways to present this material so that we don't have the secular things necessarily within our building, so that we can protect that integrity that we're wanting for our church ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, whenever it comes to like wear and tear, for example, like at one, again, the maintenance, upkeep, utilities, those were all in my previous experiences, and not every church is like this, but those were all absorbed by the church. Those costs primarily were absorbed by the church. That's not to say that the preschool did not contribute anything to those, but it was primarily absorbed by the church. And the wear and tear and the maintenance and the upkeep was significantly greater in those churches with a weekday preschool. With a good example being every summer we repainted the entire interior of the building. Right. The hallways, all the classrooms. Every summer we had to repaint the whole interior. Whereas, like in a church without that, you got to do it periodically, but, every 5-6 years or something like that, but not with the frequency, of a church that does have children, every day of the week, or 6 out of the 7 days a week. And just the physical wear and tear and having to, we had little wooden furniture that, again, we would repaint almost every year. And just the nicks and the dings and the patches in the walls and just all that kind of stuff.
All of those things.
And it's funny because we had someone come into my current church where we do not have a weekday preschool. We had someone come into the facility fairly recently, and made a comment to the effect of like, oh man, like everything just looks so nice here. And they were coming, their home church had a weekday preschool.
Right.
And so they were noticing the difference as far as like just visible wear and tear on the facilities compared to their home church. And so, yeah. So it was just
Well,
kind of, I kind of chuckled a little.
It is because it does, it takes a lot of hits, and you do have more water usage. You've got HVAC uses, you've got power and electricity, cost that's going to be in there. You also have to think about, you'll need more materials. There's more construction paper, more crayons, more pencils, more paper, more, all of those kinds of things that can be depleted very quickly have to be kept up. So you do have that idea of like, you don't want to be using all of the resources so that on Sunday morning, the Bible study teacher doesn't have, construction paper because the weekday program has taken it. So you want to make sure that you have those resources available that are going to continually be pulled upon and used. And so that can become overwhelming.
Does the school use the church's resource room, or do they have their own separate resource room? And like, does that come out of the church's budget, or does that come out of the school's budget? Like, those are the decisions, the kind of decisions that you want to make ahead of time.
Right, that you have to make ahead of time. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that there are fire codes that have to be met when you have children in the building every day. And this is the situation that most people don't understand, is that every church, as far as I know, in pretty much every county in every state, actually do fall under fire codes. And I have a lot of people that will tell me, oh, they never come and check our church. They're supposed to. They may not, especially in some smaller communities, but they are supposed to. And some of those requirements, and you mentioned those earlier, areas of egress, the way that your doorways work, the types of doors you have, all of these, sprinkler systems and fire alarms. And people will often say to me, well, we've been grandfathered in. There's really no such thing as being grandfathered in. There's a lot of communities that do that, but that's not necessarily like a written in stone kind of thing. So that if you have a new fire chief that comes in, if you have a new county administrator, they can change that at any moment, because technically you are required by the state to have these certain standards that you keep. When you have a weekday ministry, when you have a daycare, when you have a school, those things have to be checked on a regular basis, because you have to have that to maintain your licensure. So that means that, let's say you have never had a fire inspector come into your building, you now legally have to have a fire inspector come into your building on a regular basis. And that means that anything that they find, they can cite you for, you have to have adjusted. At one of our churches, we had a new fire inspector come in, and they gave us 6 months to replace every single door in our building. That is a cost when you have a building that has hundreds of doors, and we had to do it in 6 months. So they can literally come in at any moment and change anything if they choose to.
Yes.
And a lot of people will say, well, okay, so we only have to follow fire codes, and then we have our state licensing codes that we have to follow. But there's also something called a health and safety code that most counties have. That's a separate visit that you have, and those are the people that are looking to see how recently has your building been painted. How functional are your water fountains? Do you have water fountains? What is the water situation in your restrooms? How many restrooms do you have? How are your restrooms configured? What do your playgrounds look like? What do the gates on your playground look like? Those are the kinds of things that health and safety codes are looking at. So that's 3 separate inspections that you're going to be having throughout the year. And if your county does not have all of those things, it would be very surprising to me at this point in our world. But that doesn't mean that they could not come up at any moment, because those things are a typical requirement in most communities across the country. So those are a lot of other things that you have to add, especially then if you are going to provide meals, then that's a whole nother inspection for kitchen and, refrigeration and freezer and stoves and ventilation. And so there's a lot to it that a lot of people don't think of, like, oh, well, we're just opening our church doors for people. It's not quite that simple.
It's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it does take a lot. It takes a lot.
Well, and one of the things too, at my current church, one of our our preschool building, our preschool and children's areas are quite old. The newer portion is itself about 25 years old. So, and, one of the things, kind of, and whenever I first started coming and kind of getting the tour, and they're like, oh, these are like hurricane windows. They're like hurricane proof windows or whatever. Because we live in an area that gets hurricanes. But my immediate question that I asked was, I said, oh, well, like, how do we get out if there's a fire? Like, can we break through it? And they're like, oh, no. And it was sort of like, we never thought about that. And they said the only way, they said, you could like fire a gun at these windows and they're not going to shatter. You have to like take them out of the frame of the building in order to like get out. And I'm like, oh, okay. And it was just sort of like that. Getting out in an emergency was never a thought. It didn't seem like it anyway.
Oh, I've worked with so many churches as they were building new buildings. And this is what amazed me, because this actually happened at the last church where I was on staff. We were getting ready to build a new building. My very first Wednesday night, I walk in and the architects are there with some plans where they've already been in the process of designing this new children's building. And they wanted me to come into the meeting, and they were so excited because they were like, oh, great, can you look at these plans? And I said, well, I really haven't had a chance. I mean, literally, this is my first day. And they were like, no, please, tell us what you think. And the very first thing I noticed was that there was only one area of egress out of every single classroom. And these are architects that build churches
for a
living.
Yes.
And so I said, well, the state requires 2 areas of egress out of every classroom. And they were like, really? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, well, we need to check into that. So even the architects that were designing the building weren't up on what the codes were for. And that wasn't because we didn't have a weekday program. This was just for the church itself. But our county at that point required that. And I was familiar because I had had a lot of fire inspections over the years. And so we can't just count on other people knowing this information. We have to really look and know what is required.
Yes.
Because so many people go into it not realizing, just like you said, that we have to have a way to get out if we can't go out this door. Like there has to be another way out.
And it's like, that one seems very straightforward. In the architect's defense, oftentimes they work across counties or state lines, and there are things that are different.
Right.
I mean, that one seems very straightforward though, but like it's going to be pretty universal, but there are differences across counties and state lines and that kind of thing. So
there are, and also that people that are just not familiar, and so that's just not something that they've ever had to worry about or think about, and so you have to really process it all. But we don't give you this list again as trying to talk anyone out of doing any kind of ministry, but we want to make you aware of some of the obstacles that come through these ministries. And the things that we just talked about are a lot of the things that you are going to have to face as you are building this program. And so you want to be prepared and aware.
Well, because the last thing you want to have happen is to have an inspection happen. Let's say you're a month into the school year and they say, okay, you've got 6 months to replace all these doors, and you're looking at it and it's going to be tens of thousands of dollars, and your church, the school, whatever, can't absorb that cost, and so instead you're having to shut down mid-year. Stuff like that is, we just, the point is to to bring up all these considerations. That way you're thinking about these things before you make that commitment, before you open the doors, before you get started to try to prevent something crazy like that. So,
well, these are the things that I recommend for you to do if you are thinking about starting a weekday ministry. These are sort of some of the steps that you want to begin with, so that you can make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row, so that you're sure that you are familiar with all of the possible pitfalls, all of the things that you want to be prepared for. And so these are just a few of the things that I recommend that you do. First, I would start with a study committee. You want to get a group of people from your church together to begin to review the possibility of starting a ministry like this. You want to remember that this is a business. Even though it is a ministry, it also has to be run as a business as well. So that means that this committee would be very helpful if you could find educators, maybe people that are already involved in weekday or daycare programs, physicians, contractors, people that do construction, maybe if you have firemen that that are members of your church that could be on this committee. You want to think about all of the things that you're going to be looking at, people that are familiar with designing curriculum for a school, if you have principals that are attending your church, people like that are going to be great for you to put together just a study committee to say, these are the things that we need to look at and consider, and we need help. You don't want this to be only your decision. You need to make sure that your community is going to be supporting you in this. So you want to make sure that you include as many people. You don't want that committee to be just huge. I always felt like it was good to have 6 or 7, maybe 8 people on a committee, just so that you keep it small enough to not be overwhelming, but still to have enough people that can really give you some advice.
Yeah, and particularly just like what you're saying, those people who have knowledge in those particular areas that are relevant to, starting a ministry like that.
Yeah. You want to start off with determine your purpose. Why are we doing this? Have a mission statement. Know what you're getting into. This is why we're doing this ministry. This is how it's going to relate to the church and how the church is going to relate to it. So you want to have that. You do have to determine, what are you going to start with? Are you going to start with trying maybe doing a Parents' Day Out program and then go into a half-day weekday program, or if you want to go into full day, or if you're wanting to just jump in and start a Christian school, you've got to kind of decide where you're going to begin, where you want to start. You want to determine the interest in your community. And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, but you want to do some sort of a survey within your community. You want to find out, do we have parents that are looking for daycare? Are we going to have enough people in our neighborhood or in the community that are going to find this useful and actually use this ministry, because you don't want to jump in and then realize, oh, there's not even any families in our area that are needing this or wanting this. So you want to do some sort of a survey or a study to kind of get an idea of how many families you would be starting with if you do begin this.
If you were to do that. I think one of the things that I would be curious about would be the wait lists of other similar facilities in the area. Like if you're wanting to start a preschool and every preschool has a year-long wait list that a family has to get on the second they know they're expecting, or nobody has a wait list. That's not even a thing. Like those would be interesting things that I know I would want to know.
Well, and I think if you can talk with people in your community that have these ministries already, if you know of churches in your community that already have weekday ministries, if you know of, other daycare programs that are in your community, if you can talk with some of those directors, get some feedback from them, find out, if they feel like that would be something beneficial for the community, they could give you some specific insight into that. I would also contact your denominational leadership. From whatever denomination you are. Some will have, people, consultants that they have, other people that they are familiar with that are very well versed in the topic, that could spend some time with you, that could talk with you about the pros and cons, that can help you with that information. And so that's definitely an area that you want to check into and see. A lot of communities have meetings sometime during the summer for ministries that are starting weekday daycare programs, those kinds of things, where they'll actually go through the guidelines with a group of people, and it's a free meeting that you just attend. They give you their handbook and they go through everything. A lot of communities have those meetings throughout the year, so you might want to check with your own education department in your county, find out if they have those kinds of requirements and those meetings that you would want to be a part of, so that you can get a little bit of a heads up on what the requirements would be for your licensure. So I think that that would be very important for you to do. You want to meet with your insurance company. You want to meet with your church leadership, with your staff members, have discussions with them. You want to meet with your church lay people. You want to have a congregational meeting to talk about this opportunity and this possibility and get feedback from them and find out what they might be thinking, how they are going to respond to the possibility of you starting this ministry.
And I think especially meeting with the ministry leaders in your church and thinking through the things that do go on during the week at your church and thinking about possible times where events or facilities might need to be deconflicted. So say, for example, your plan is for this weekday preschool to use the fellowship hall for their meals for lunch, but you also host funeral meals in the fellowship hall. So, then just thinking through like, okay, realistically, how many funeral meals do we do a year? Is there any other place where the kids or where the funeral meal could go? Just sort of thinking through those potential conflicts. And then also thinking through, okay, like let's say we're not trying to use the same space at the same time, but if we have lots of adults on the campus for a separate event, like a funeral, like senior adult event, something like that, how do we make sure that the kids, like their safety and security, and that they are inaccessible to whatever else is happening on campus? So just some of those considerations. And that, again, if you're a children's ministry person, you may not be thinking about the senior adult thing that they do every week or every month or whatever, and how those two may conflict.
Right. Because when you do have funerals, when you have weddings, when you have these other events, when you have Vacation Bible School, if you have maybe a camp program or something that you do during the summer with kids, those things are going to affect how you are using your space. And so those are things that you have to consider and think about, how would we handle that, because you do need to know. You want to maybe go ahead and have somebody from your fire department come and do a walkthrough through your building. One of the things that I always do tell leaders is that you realize that when you are inviting the fire department into your building, then you are going to have the possibility that they may find things that need to be repaired, that might need to be changed, that might need to be fixed. Again, that's not a negative in that they're supposed to be doing that anyway. But a lot of communities, they just don't make churches a priority because their schools and their daycares are a priority. So a lot of times we might go years in a church building without it. So it is a big thing to invite them into your building. But if you are very seriously considering it, that would be a good first step for you to kind of see how compliant is my building and how well is that going to work for us to be able to make the changes that we need to make. You're going to have to determine what would be a competitive salary. So you're going to need to check your community and find out what do they pay daycare teachers and leaders at this point for their work each day. And so you want to be prepared with that so that you can begin to put together a budget. Because you do need to have that in place before you even move into that next decision, because you want to make sure that this is something that you absolutely are able to do as a ministry and make it sustainable until you're able to make at least a little bit of that money back to be able to be self-sufficient is your goal.
Yes.
But that's not going to happen at first. So you need to be prepared for that. And then again, you're going to want to, if you do decide to go forward with this, you are going to want to create a leadership team, a board of directors for this ministry that's going to be on a more permanent basis to be able to help you make decisions along the way. So you do want to start thinking about the people that can be there from the very beginning that can help support the ministry.
Yeah, and another consideration that isn't so much related to weekday schools in general, but is something that I wanted to mention that I found out about, I guess a few years ago and was kind of surprised by, has more to do with homeschool groups. Like if you have a homeschool group using your facilities during the week, I did not know this until a few years ago, that each individual like local homeschool group, even if they are a part of a larger organization, each individual group can be registered either as a nonprofit entity or a for-profit entity. And even if they're for-profit, it doesn't mean that they're like making a lot of money. It just, things are a lot easier in a lot of ways with like the paperwork. But one of the interesting considerations there is that if they are a for-profit entity, and if your church charges them any sort of fee, even a nominal fee, for utilizing the facilities, then that can endanger your church's nonprofit status. Again, listen, because just truthfully, I'm not really in that homeschool world. It never even crossed my mind that a homeschool group would technically be for profit. I never even thought about that. And so that's another one of those very unusual considerations that caught me off guard, and that I just wanted to make sure and mention sort of in the midst of this whole conversation. Yeah.
Well, and that's something that you really need to talk very carefully, not only with your church insurance representatives, but also with your church attorneys, because you want to make sure that all of this has been, done correctly and done with integrity, and that's done well, so that you don't have to go back and try to fix something that's not working quite right. So it's just always good to have as many hands involved to help you as you make these decisions, to make sure that you're seeing it from all viewpoints.
Well, right. And, there are, and I feel like, I know we've thrown out so many considerations and so many thoughts and things, but there are churches every year who are starting new preschools, daycares, Christian schools. And so, if your church is like, no, like, we've considered all these things, we for sure want to do this, I mean, reach out to some of those churches who have started schools recently, within the past 5 years or so, because they are going to be more familiar with, what's up to date, what's recent, the expectations and the requirements and all this stuff. And so, so there are churches who are doing it every year, all the time. And so it's just, even if it's getting in a Facebook group and being like, hey, this is what our church is thinking about doing. If you've done this within the past 5 years, 2 years, whatever, can I talk to you? Let me hear about your experiences. Let me hear about your preparations. Let me hear about things that you would do the same, things that you would do differently. And so there are definitely like resources and people who you can talk to who can help give you guidance and clarity and that sort of thing in this process. So yeah, so I mean, it's there's a lot of considerations, but it's doable, and people do it all the time.
It is, and it can be a huge blessing for your church. It just is something that you want to go into with a great deal of prayer, that you want to make sure that this is what God is calling your ministry to do, so that you are doing it to the best of your ability, so that you're doing it really well, so that it can be a great example of how believers can come together to help families and to help children and to teach them the Word of God. And so there's so much to consider, and I hope we haven't overwhelmed you, or this episode has gone a lot longer than I expected it to. I really didn't think we would be talking for very long about this, but there's just so much to think about and consider. And so hopefully we have given you at least some basic guidelines, a little bit of a framework of how you can begin to start thinking through this in a logical and organized way, so that you can make all of the best decisions that you possibly can. We just thank you so much for joining us and for taking time with us today. We hope this has been helpful. We would ask that you would like and subscribe and all the things. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.